Violent clashes of war between Ukraine and Russia continue to shift from the Donetsk region to the southern front lines. Kyiv's major offensive plans have swept the Zaporizhzhia region for a few weeks. The clashes here are mostly on critical front lines such as Orikhiv, Vasilivka, Polowy, Storozhev, Tokmak, and Melitopol in the southwest of Velika Novosilka. With the recent capture of Storozhev by Ukrainian forces, a very important supply and connection line was formed between Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia. In this way, the Ukrainians continue to support the clashes in Orikhiv and successfully advance on the other southern front lines. The fight against Russian positions south of Zaporizhzhia involves tanks and armored vehicles supplied from the west, as well as infantry supported by artillery. There have been reports of intense fighting outside the town of Tokmak, an important Russian logistics center. Ukrainian troops reportedly stepped up their efforts to penetrate deep into the Orikhiv-Tokmak region, which block the road to the Russian-occupied city of Melitopol. Unconfirmed reports suggested that German-made Leopard tanks and U.S. Bradleys were deployed along with numerous other armored vehicles. In other words, the Ukrainians aimed to seize the connection roads between Crimea and southern Ukraine by cutting off Russian logistics on the southern front lines. Some of the most tangible proof of this was the deployment of Western war tanks by the Ukrainians. Even the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, stated that the Ukrainian forces, consisting of up to 1,500 soldiers from Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade and 150 armored vehicles, continue offensive operations on critical front lines such as Zaporizhzhia and Tokmak. Regarding Melitopol, Shoigu claimed that the Russian forces carried out these attacks on the Ukrainian army as a preemptive strike. However, images released by the Russian military blogger Ribber showed that Ukrainian armor remained inactive during the attack, contradicting both Shoigu's and the Russian claims. Recent clues indicate that the Ukrainian forces advance along the southern front lines, especially in the Orikhiv-Tokmak-Melitopol regions, is intensifying. Vladimir Rogov, a Russian occupation official in the region, told the RIA Novosti news agency that Ukrainian forces applied maximum force against Russian positions in the Zaporizhzhia region. Rogov's statement holds true, as on the front lines of Zaporizhzhia, Melitopol, and Tokmak, Ukrainian special forces, partisan groups, and volunteer Ukrainian units supporting Kyiv have assumed a significant role in breaking through the Russian trenches. The operational and intelligence work of Ukrainian partisans on the southern front lines is crucial for Kyiv's major offensive plans. While the partisans primarily gather intelligence in the south of Ukraine, they occasionally carry out remarkable operations. An example of this occurred near the Zaporizhzhia-Melitopol region, where Ukrainian partisan groups launched an incredible offensive operation in the settlement of Yakimivka, blowing up a railway bridge used by invaders to supply weapons from Crimea. This noteworthy offensive operation is vital for Ukraine because the recent attacks in the Zaporizhzhia region, coupled with the bridge's destruction in the Yakimivka settlement, seem to increase Ukrainian dominance. As the Russians already face a shortage of military resources on the Ukrainian southern front lines, losing another link between Crimea and Ukraine complicates their ability to withstand the Ukrainian major offensive operations in Zaporizhzhia. Despite Russia's anticipation of a Ukrainian offensive in this direction and the construction of multi-layered defenses, including zigzag trenches and obstacles, these security measures are proving ineffective, thanks to the mind-blowing war strategies employed by the Ukrainians. Currently, Ukraine's efforts are focused on the village of Robotnitz on the Orikhiv-Tokmak highway and outside Orikhiv. Russian sources reported offensive operations by armored and infantry units in Robotnik, where both Ukrainian and Russian aviation are active. However, recent events indicate that the Ukrainians have launched more dominant and effective attacks in these areas. Russian troops, led by Vladimir Putin, appear confused and concerned about the Ukrainian efforts, as they have begun taking security measures against possible Ukrainian attacks in the Orikhiv-Tokmak direction. The Russian infantry continues to advance towards Orikhiv-Tokmak and attempts to hold the position. Russian artillery and tanks are intensively engaged in positions along this direction, but Ukrainian military equipment, such as the M1 Bradley and German Leopard 2 tanks, provide an advantage on critical front lines such as Zaporizhzhia, Melitopol, Tokmak, and especially Orikhiv. The ongoing attacks and offensive plans near Zaporizhia will be studied intensively, since this part of the front has long been seen as a potential axis for a Ukrainian attack on Melitopol, Mariupol, Berdyansk, and Crimea. One of Ukraine's goals in the south and east is believed to be cutting the Russian land bridge connecting the long-occupied southern and eastern regions to Crimea. However, Ukraine requires further military support to neutralize the Kerch Bridge, the most important strategic link between Crimea and Russia. The inclusion of the M1 Bradley and German Leopard 2 tanks on the battlefield has allowed the Ukrainians to execute their grand offensive plans with incredible success in and around Zaporizhia. The reinforcements provided to the Ukrainian army may help destroy the Kerch Bridge and potentially enable the Ukrainians to liberate Crimea once again. In this regard, the United States announced an additional $1.2 billion in military aid to Ukraine, including air defense systems and conventional drone ammunition. The aid package also includes technology for integrating Western air defense launchers, missiles, and radar with Ukraine's domestic air defense systems. In summary, the military support from the West and the USA, the determination and skill of Ukrainian soldiers, and their integration with Western weapons are crucial for the successful continuation of the major offensive operations currently conducted by the Ukrainian army and for the expulsion of Russian forces from occupied Ukrainian territory. The war between Ukraine and Russia is currently locked in a critical corridor of aggression between Zaporizhia and Donetsk. Ukrainian forces launched an incredible offensive against the southern lines of Velika Novosilka, which drastically changed the course of Zaporizhia. First of all, the city of Stoichevik became the target of the Ukrainians. Kiev's offensive plans continue in the southern settlement of Blahodad. After the capture of Storazev, after the Ukrainians captured Blahodad, they continued to advance. In the south of the city, to the south of the city was the Makievka settlement. The Ukrainians succeeded in clearing this region of Russians as well. On the other hand, the settlement of Neskikny between Velika Novosilka and the city of Storazev was one of the regions captured as a result of the offensive operations of the Ukrainians. After all, these areas were liberated by the Ukrainian forces. Kiev's offensive plans began to shift in different directions. This time, the Ukrainians began to concentrate on the areas to the west of an offensive corridor running from north to south as far as Velika, Novosilka, and the Staromansky Urozhny or front line. West of this assault corridor were settlements such as Ternopil, Novofedorivka, Livani, and Biryatchi. Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky reported that his army continues to advance in this direction and has gained very important ground. In line with these statements, Ukrainian forces managed to wave blue-yellow flags in the cities of Novodarivka and Livani. The striking advance of the Ukrainian forces was also acknowledged by international intelligence sources and important media outlets. But how far had the Ukrainians advanced in total on these strategic front lines between Zaporizhia and Donetsk? The answer to this question was answered by the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Hanna Maliar. After the Ukrainian forces captured regions such as Storazev, Blahodad, Neskikny, and Makarivka and waved their first legs in Livani and Novoaidar, Hanna Maliar first cordially congratulated her army. Then Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine Maliar announced that in addition to these 6 settlements, his forces also captured Lobkov. Maliar announced that as a result of all this, the Ukrainian armed forces advanced 6.5 kilometers in the Zaporozhye-Donetsk steppes and took control of an area of 90 kilometers squared. According to Hanna Maliar's statements, the reclaimed area was only a fraction of the 40,000 mi occupied by Russia. Maliar did not elaborate on exactly when the offensive operations were carried out, while 7 settlements were captured in just 1 week. However, when we follow the attack routes of the Ukrainian forces, we can easily understand when attacks occurred in which settlements. Moscow has yet to formally acknowledge any advances by Ukraine, but prominent Russian military bloggers noted that Ukrainian forces had actually captured Blahodad, Neskikny, and Makarivka and were advancing south. The Russian Ministry of Defense repeated its regular claims last week that repulsed attempts to attack the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions. The Russian ministry claimed that 8 Ukrainian drones were destroyed and ammunition depot was hit in eastern Ukraine. But this time clashes were raging in and near Zaporizhia Oblast rather than Donetsk region. In other words, the Russian Ministry of Defense was trying to attract the attention of the Ukrainian army's advance in Zaporizhia. In addition, the Russians are currently trying to block the advance of Ukrainian forces from the Zaporizhia region to the much wider borders. A senior official from Ukraine's defense spokesperson reported that the Russians made unbelievable moves to achieve this goal. It has been suggested that Russia blew up a dam in Mokryani to make it more difficult for Ukrainian forces to advance further south. But this is a very risky move. Already a dam on the much larger Dnipro River was destroyed last week, causing a humanitarian disaster in parts of the south. With the collapse of Kakhovka Dam, many Russian trench lines, both in this area and in the Kherson region, were flooded. Likewise, the fact that Russian forces blow up the dam at Mercurially does not actually stop the advance of the Ukrainians. Maybe this move could cause Kiev's offensive plans to move in different directions, but the Russian would only put themselves at risk by blowing up this dam. The reason for this is that there are still resisting Russian groups in the fake settlements captured by the Ukrainians. So after Russian forces blew up the dam at Mokryani, they endangered the Russian resistance groups in the settlement in Zaporizhia, which the Ukrainians captured. Some Russian groups waiting here to defend themselves against Ukrainian attacks may have been submerged by the collapse of the dam. These Russian forces have nowhere else to flee because Ukrainian partisan groups have established a serious pressure in the Melitopol-Tokmak-Kherson triangle. Already, Kherson Oblast continues to experience the effects of the flood disaster. In other words, the resistance of the Russian groups does not seem to be able to escape the effects of the blowing up of the dam in Mokryani. But this tactic of the Russians have been going on since the beginning of the war. The Russian armed forces and the Russian defense minister under the leadership of President Vladimir Putin have repeatedly attempted to halt the Ukrainian advance, if necessary, at the expense of their own troops. Therefore, these policies of the Moscow administration are likened to Russian roulette. Be willing to deliberately lose your own soldiers to stop your opponent on the Ukrainian side. Things are a little different in Zelensky's army. Concepts such as volunteerism and patriotism are at the forefront. As for successes on the battlefield, the result is hardly surprising. When Ukraine receives tens of billions of dollars in weapons training and intelligence from the West, combined with its own battlefield determination, tactics, and motivation to drive Russia from its territory, especially after decisive progress in the Zaporizhia region, Ukrainians also know that to maintain the same level of military, financial, and political support from the West, it may need to make significant progress over the summer, and may first they have a chance to recover from the loss and destruction caused by Moscow. Of course, the West continues to support Ukraine against the Russian occupation no matter what. Even the so-called Weimar Triangle. Leaders of France, Germany, and Poland met in Paris recently to discuss Ukraine and other issues. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz answered affirmatively when asked whether Germany had agreed at the NATO summit in July that Ukraine should be given security guarantees. French President Emmanuel Macron said at the same meeting that he had spoken to Zelensky at a press conference recently, confirming the start of the counterattack. In addition, Macron assured that Ukraine will be supported under all circumstances, just like France and Germany. Positive reactions came from Poland about the Ukraine issues. Poland has already become one of the countries that send the most aid to Ukraine. The views of the Warsaw government that they would continue to support Kiev were amongst the most important indicators of the solid alliance, which was emphasized at the meeting. On the other hand, some Western military analysts stated that it is still too early to draw conclusions and that the conflict so far may indicate that Ukraine is still testing the Russian defenses. A Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, in a statement on this issue, stated that it is too early to say exactly where Ukraine's counterattack is headed. However, Blinken added that Washington is confident that Kiev will continue to be successful. Many military analysts and war experts agreed that the liberation of the Crimean Peninsula is at the finest center of Kiev's offensive plans in the short term. It is said that after the clashes in Zaporizhia, Bakhmut might be active again. It would not be unreasonable to support this thesis, as the Ukrainian operations are also aimed at gaining control of the southern fronts. The Ukrainian army had a fairly productive day for the upcoming victory. While Russian troops focused their main war effort on an attempt to completely capture the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, the Ukrainian defense forces repelled all 23 offensive attempts by the Russian army, especially in Bakhmut. This is also a record for the Ukrainian army. In total, over the past day, the Ukrainian Air Force has carried out 10 attacks on the manpower and equipment clusters of the Russian army. Ukrainian rocket and artillery units struck 2 Russian armament clusters, an ammunition depot, 2 anti-aircraft missile systems, and 2 E-war systems. Ukrainian defenders also destroyed a reconnaissance drone. Also, during the past day, Russian forces carried out 7 missile, 25 airstrikes and about 20 artillery strikes on Ukrainian Defense Force positions and settlements on the southern front. While the Ukrainian army repelled most of these attacks, a few hit attacks damaged Ukraine. A number of private residential buildings, educational facilities, and other civil and administrative infrastructure objects were damaged. It was also reported that there were casualties among civilians. The Ukrainian General Staff continues to issue warnings and remain on alert, despite the fact that Russian missile and airstrikes continue throughout Ukraine's territory. So what's going on in the rest of Ukraine? According to the Ukrainian General Staff, there has been no significant change in the operational situation in the Volyn and Polessia directions, where no signs of the formation of Russian attack groups have been detected. Russia continues to maintain its military presence in the areas bordering Ukraine in the direction of Chuvashia and Slobozhizhina. The other day, the Russian army made an unsuccessful attempt to deploy a sabotage group along the state border of Ukraine in the village of Zeleny Kharkiv region. The sabotage group was excluded from the battle by the Ukrainian border security. According to initial reports, 12 Russian saboteurs were killed. The Russian army carried out missile attacks on the Vovchansk region and airstrikes on 3 settlements in the Kharkiv region. Russian mortar shells struck 7 settlements in the Chernihiv region, 10 settlements in the Sumy region, 6 settlements in the Kharkiv region. But these attacks did not yield any results in the direction of Kupiansk. The Russian army could not gain any gain by